Are we all ready to film?
Almost. We just need the granny square.
Aha! I left it on the craft table.
I don't see it here.
Oh, maybe I left it downstairs. You want to check the kitchen and I'll check the family room?
Okay.
Did you find it?
I didn't. I looked everywhere.
So did I. It's got to be up here somewhere.
Oh, there it is.
Oh my gosh, it was up here the whole time?
All right, let's get started.
Thank you. Hey everybody, welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. A few years ago, we made a beginner's tutorial on how to make a granny square. And since then, we've had more questions about granny squares than any of the other projects we've done here. And since 2018 is the year in which I resolved to bust through my stash, we thought we would revisit the humble granny square since it's my all-time favorite stash busting motif. One of the most requested videos we've had here is how to make a solid colored granny square. So today I'm going to show you how I like to make a solid colored granny square. I'm going to answer some of those frequently asked questions, and I'm going to take you through some of the refinements I've made to the basic pattern that allow me to whip these up really quickly. I've made thousands of granny squares in my lifetime. I've made little ones and big ones, multicolored ones, solid colored ones. I've made them to bust through my stash, and I've even worked on planned colorway projects using that basic granny square. And if you want more inspiration or to hear more about these particular projects and how you can use your granny squares in different blankets, then stay tuned to the end because I'm going to talk about them in more detail. But for now, grab your hooks, grab your yarn, let's head on over to the craft table and we will stitch up a solid colored granny square together. Today I am making a small granny square. This granny square is 5.5 inches across and 4 rows tall. You can count how many rows a granny square has by starting in the middle, counting the first shell, and then counting on a diagonal out to the edge. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 shells on the diagonal means 4 rows. Alternatively, you can count the shells running up any of the sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 shells, 4 rows. And this leads me to my first most frequently asked question: how much yarn do you require for a single granny square? Well, that will vary wildly depending on the thickness of the yarn you choose, the size of the hook you use, and how many rows you put on your granny. Today I'm using a medium weight yarn. Medium weight yarn, also known as worsted, Aran, DK or double knit, or size 4. Please note that the thickness of yarns in this category will vary a little bit, but there will be roughly 15 grams of this size yarn required for a 4-row granny square using a 5.5 millimeter hook or an I9. This is a standard medium-sized hook and works nicely with medium-sized yarn. I'm also going to need a pair of scissors and a yarn needle, and if you've got all that together, we can jump right into the tutorial. Granny squares come in many different shapes and sizes and motifs, but one thing they mostly have in common is that they start in the middle and they work their way outwards. You can start in the middle of your granny square by creating a ring of any kind. This particular granny square was started with a chained ring, and that's the method I'm going to show today. This granny square was begun with a cinch circle, also known as a sliding loop or a magic circle. This allows you to create a very tight, almost non-existent circle or sort of space at the center of your granny square, and sometimes you want that. We're going to begin, however, with a chained ring. We start with a slip knot, which we place on our hook. Make sure it's not too tight or too loose. And this leads me to another frequently asked question, and that is how many chains to work into a beginning ring. The answer is whatever works for you. If you're a very new beginner to crochet, you want to create a ring that is big enough for you to easily identify and work into. So I would recommend 5, 6, or 7 chains. Once you're comfortable making this kind of a granny square and you can readily identify your center, you can gradually reduce the number of chains in your beginning ring down to 4 perhaps at a minimum, and that will make the hole in the center of your granny square smaller. Today though, I'm going to begin with 6 chains. Once you have the number of chains you want, for me that's 6, you can continue to create your ring by taking your hook, passing it through the first stitch that you created, wrapping your yarn over and pulling back through everything. And that gives you a stable ring, and you can see that it fits over my finger here, into which we're going to build our first row of the granny square. So there's the ring I started for this square, and here it is here. The first row has 4 individual shells into it. So this is a shell, this is a shell, that and that. Each shell consists of 3 individual stitches. We're using the double crochet. So whether you started with a cinch circle or a chained ring, we're all going to begin with 3 chains to start row 1. These 3 chains count as a double crochet. They are the same height as a double crochet, and for the purpose of this pattern, every time you begin a row with 3 chains, it counts as the first stitch in that row. So 3 chains equals 1 double crochet. 1 shell, or a granny shell, which is the base part of this pattern, is 3 double crochets worked together, separated by chains. A double crochet is yarn over, place your hook through the ring you created, grab the yarn, pull it back so that you have 3 loops on your hook, yarn over, back through 2, yarn over, back through 2. That's how you make a double crochet. And you can check out our other videos, links provided in the description box down below, if you need a little help with that. 1 more double crochet rounds out the first shell in our first row of our granny square. Remember that chain 3 counts, so that is a shell. In order to separate it from the next shell, we want to chain 2. And this brings me to another frequently asked question. I'm creating a corner here. As you can see, this shell in row 1 and this shell in row 1 sit kitty corner to each other. There is a corner space between them and each of the next 2 sets. That's how we make the corner, by chaining 2. Some people use 3, some people use 1, but I always recommend that you have at least 1 more chain in your corner space than you have between the shells that run along the side. And we'll get to that. We're not actually working any side chains in row 1. We'll get to that in row 2. But for me, I like 2 chains because it creates a nice little 90-degree angle and gives your yarn enough space to turn a corner. The next shell is 3 double crochets. And you can already tell, because I put in those 2 chains, there's a bit of a corner happening here. If you need it to stand out a little more, put your fingers in that corner and pull it out a bit. And if you're having trouble seeing the center ring, always take a moment to stick your finger through it to keep it large, especially if you're still new to crochet and you're not familiar with that center space yet. We need to create another corner, so that means we need to chain 2 more. And then we work on our 3rd shell, which is 3 double crochet. And for those of you comfortable with the granny square, you know that a row is completed when there are 4 sides. We've got shell 1 and a corner, shell 2 and a corner, shell 3, we need another corner, so that's 2 chains. We're going to work our last shell, which is 3 double crochet, all into that center ring. And before we close off row 1, we need to finish with the last corner. We have 1 corner here, 1 corner here, 1 corner here, chain 2, that's your last corner, and you can find the top of your chain 3 that you began the row with, slip your hook into it, and slip stitch to close off the row. If you have trouble seeing it, pull up on your loop, put your square down on your working surface, put your fingers and thumbs in all 4 of those corner spaces and pull outwards. You can see the square. After every single row you complete, and you complete a row by slip stitching into the top of the chain 3, you can be done. So if I wanted a micro mini granny square, I could do a single row of shells into a circle and then fasten off, and I would be done my little miniature granny square. But we're going to continue, and for every single row that I add to a granny square, I always like to start it in a corner, no matter how many rows I do. And this is how I do that. I join with a slip stitch in the top of the chain 3, and then slip stitch across the top of the next 2 double crochets. I keep my slip stitches nice and loose because I don't want to tighten up that shell. And these are almost not visible at all, so I wouldn't worry about it if you were worrying about it. Once you get to the next space, it will always be a chain 2 corner space. Slip stitch directly into that, and that puts you in a corner ready to begin your next row. And every row will end and begin the same way. Every row begins with a chain 3, and every chain 3 counts as a double crochet. Into that corner space, and since from here on out we are only ever working in spaces, which is another reason I like the grannies, it's always easy to see where you're at, we want to complete our first shell by adding 2 more double crochets worked into that same space. Another nice thing about having slightly larger spaces in your granny square, especially if you're new to crochet, is that it's easy to identify what the spaces are and what the shells are, and you're less likely to accidentally work in between your stitches. First shell is a chain 3 with 2 double crochets, and we have not completed work in this corner space yet. We need to chain 2, because that will create the corner space for the next row. And before we leave this space altogether, we're going to work another shell into it, which is 3 double crochets. If you watched our previous video on how to make a granny square, you'll hear me singing shell, chain 2, shell, over and over and over. And that's because every corner space gets a shell, chain 2, shell, which is 3 double crochets, 2 chains, and 3 more double crochets. That works out nicely to make a corner. Every row from row 2 on outward has sides to it, and in between shells that run along the sides, I like to create a single chain to act as a little bit more of a spacer. These spaces between my shells, so I can easily see all of my shells, are big enough that I can stick a finger through, and that little chain is what gives me a bit of breathing space between shells, and also just enough room to work 3 more double crochets into that space on successive rows. So that's why I like a single chain between my shells, a little bit of extra breathing room. Also, when you flatten it out and square it up and block it, it retains its nice square shape. So a corner space is 2 chains, a regular space is 1 chain. The next space we're working into is a corner chain 2 space, and every corner chain 2 space gets shell, chain 2, shell. So that's 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet. You can really see that side taking shape now. So we started down here with our chain 3, finished off our shell, finished off the whole corner, worked a single chain, so that helps identify or really define that side between shells, and then finished off the next corner with a double crochet, or shell, chain 2, shell, 3 double crochets, 2 chains, 3 double crochets. So that first side is really taking shape. We're on a side, we want to chain 1 between shells to sort of help really define that side. The next space we're working is a chain 2 corner, and that gets shell, chain 2, shell. Chain 1, it helps define the side. The next space you're working is a corner, so it's shell, chain 2, shell. Once you finish your last corner, shell, chain 2, shell, you want to remember to chain 1 before you close off your second row by joining with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3. And here's where that little bit of magic happens. Slip stitch to close, that's the end of row 2. You can put your fingers and thumbs in your corners and pull out. You can really see that square taking shape. But we want to start row 3, we want to start in a corner, and like I promised, all you have to do after you finish a row is slip stitch across the next 2 stitches, slip stitch into the next space, and that space will always be a chain 2 corner. So you can always start a row in a corner. Every corner is chain 3 to begin, so you want to chain 3 to start the row, finish off that shell by working 2 more double crochets, and because you're starting in a corner space, you know that in order to complete your corner, you work shell, chain 2, shell, all into that corner space. Once you leave your corner, you want to chain 1 because we're defining those sides. And the next space you're going to work is a chain 1 space from the previous row. Row 3 is pretty much what you're going to repeat for every single row from here until the end of your granny square, no matter how many rows you want that to be. When you get to a chain 1 space, or the space between shells along a side, you work a shell. 3 double crochet. The next shell you're going to work is going to be into a chain 2 space. But before you get there, you want to chain 1 for a spacer. And since it's a chain 2 space, you know you have to work shell, chain 2, shell. After you've finished shell, chain 2, shell for a corner, you're working along the straight, so you want to chain 1 for a spacer in between your single shells. The next shell you're working is going to be into a chain 1 space, so that means 1 chain, 1 shell. 1 shell is 3 double crochets. Chain 1 for a spacer, and the next space you get to is a chain 2 corner. A chain 2 corner means 2 shells. Shell, chain 2, shell. And that's a handy way to remember it too. If the space is 2 chains, that means you need 2 shells. But that also means it's a corner, so don't forget to add the 2 chains in between each of your shells. When you're working along the side of your granny squares, you're working into a single chain space, and a single chain means a single shell. Chain 1 leading out of every single corner. The next space will be a chain 1 space, so 1 chain equals 1 shell. And that's all you need to do to complete row 3. When you get to the end of row 3, or in fact any row, you will always find yourself back at the chain 3 you began with. Don't forget that single chain, that last little spacer, before you join to the top of that chain 3, and you can just jam your hook in anywhere. And that's another frequently asked question. What part of the top of the chain 3 do I use? Well, I say stick it in however it works. If you want to try to hook it under the 2 top loops, you can do that, but it's kind of time consuming. I like to just poke it right through the top and slip stitch. Row 3 is exactly the formula you will follow for every other row, no matter how big you make your granny square. But today I'm making a 4-row granny, so I'm going to take you through it all over again. This is the magic end and beginning for this granny square. We joined with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3. All we have to do is slip stitch across the next 2 stitches, nice and loose. Slip stitch into the next space, and it's magically a chain 2 corner. Woohoo! Row 4, and every row begins with 3 chains. 3 chains always counts as a double crochet, and you want to finish that shell off with 2 more double crochets. 3 double crochets equals 1 shell. But because we're in a corner, you want to chain 2 for the next corner space and complete it with another shell. Shell, chain 2, shell. When you leave the corner, remember to chain 1. That's your spacer. And the very next space you get to is a chain 1 space. And from here on out, you'll have lots of chain 1 spaces. You'll have a new one. Every single row will increase by 1 new chain 1 space. So row 3 had a single chain 1 space. Row 4 has 2. Row 5 will have 3. Every row successfully from here on out will always have 1 extra chain 1 space on each side. You'll always have 4 corner spaces because a square will always have 4 corners, but the number of shells running along each side and the spaces between will always increase by 1 for every single row you add. Into that 1 chain space goes 1 shell. 1 chain equals 1 shell. 2 chains, which is a corner, equals shell, chain 2, shell. And you're going to be saying this in your dreams, I promise. Chain 1 in between shells for that spacer, and you come to another chain 1 space, so that means another shell. A single shell for a single chain 1 space. Chain 1 for a spacer, and the next space is a chain 2 corner. And that is, say it with me, shell, chain 2, shell. When you get to the end of row 4 and every row hereafter, you will join with a slip stitch to the top of the chain 3. Don't forget that last chain 1. Stick your hook in anywhere at the top of that chain 3 that it'll fit. And if you're finished your square, and I am finished, I've made a 4-row granny, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how you count your squares. Square rows, I should say. Once you're finished, you do not have to work your way over to the corner. You only have to slip stitch across the next 2 stitches and into the corner if you're going to continue adding rows. And every single row from here on out, if you want to keep going, you slip stitch across to the corner, chain 3 to begin every row, finish that shell with 2 more double crochets, chain 2, and finish the corner with another shell. Shell, chain 2, shell in every chain 2 corner space. Chain 1 for spacers all the way across. And as you can see, if we were working a 5th row, I will have 3 chain 1 spaces to work a single shell into. So every single row increases by 1 chain 1 space for each side. But you'll always have 4 corners, and those 4 corners will always be chain 2s. But since I'm done, I've fastened off my row at the top of the chain 3, and I don't want to make this any bigger. So I'm going to snip my yarn, and I'm going to give myself approximately 5 inches of yarn tail. Because this is another frequently asked question I get. How do you keep your tails from unraveling or coming out when you wash your granny square blankets after a while? So I'm going to show you today how I weave in my tails on my little granny squares. Thread up the tail you left behind in your yarn needle and flip your granny square backwards so that you're looking at the wrong side of your granny square. Or you're holding it so that the tail is ended at the corner. So you're going to be working back across that last corner. We're going to pick up a little piece of the edge of a stitch, so just a bit down from where we knotted off. So pull your tail through that, not too tightly because you don't want to pull it out of alignment, but tightly enough that your yarn tail disappears. And the first thing we're going to do is weave our needle underneath all 6 of those double crochets that were worked into that corner. So all the way through. Remember not to pull too tight, but tight enough that your yarn tail disappears. Then you're going to find the last loop of the last double crochet base, skip over top of it, and go back under the other 5.5 double crochets. So there's 5 full double crochets and the half of the last one. So all the way back. So you've double backed on your weaving in. And now we're going to do it again in the same place. So you're going to find that last loop that you came out, go over top of it, and back through the same ones. Now if this should be all you really need, especially if you're using kind of a grabby yarn like a wool or an acrylic like I have, and you can snip your yarn right here and it should not come out. But if you're using a slippery yarn, then you can do more of the same. You can weave it in by picking up the underside of the top of a stitch from the row beneath, and then go through the bottoms of the next shell. So there'll be 3 double crochets. So go through those bottoms. I'm starting to lose tail here. There we go. Pull just enough so that your tail disappears, and then same thing. Find that last loop that you came out, go over top of it, and double back over those, or underneath those double crochets. And that should be enough. You can continue weaving in until all of your tail is gone, or snip off whatever's left, and your tail should not come out. And if your tail was still left hanging at the very center where we began, you can do the same thing. You can weave them around and around, back and forth, underneath all of those nice, tightly stacked double crochets in row 1. But that is how I weave in my tails. And there you have it, That's how I like to make a solid colored granny square. That's 4 rows, but if you just keep repeating that same pattern over and over again, you can make these as big as you like. That's a small to medium-sized granny square, and that's one of the sizes that I use a lot in my different blanket projects. And now, let's talk about some of those blanket projects. In 2016, we made a calendar blanket based on daily temperatures. This is a temperature block a day for every day of 2016. I chose to make really small granny squares. Each granny square is only 2 rows, so this isn't quite a micro mini granny square, but it's pretty small. The small granny squares allowed me to not use up too much yarn at a time, but still allowed me to make a nice colored block that was not going to blend in too much with the rest of them. So you ended up with this really nifty pixelated effect, and I absolutely love this blanket. It's one of the prettiest ones I've ever made, and that is just a small mini granny square. And it looks so different than some of the other granny square blankets I've made. I did this in the join as you go method, which gives me tiny little spaces between the granny squares, very similar to the spaces in the granny squares themselves. I love the overall effect, and it was a lot of fun to make. The year I met my husband, I made him a big granny square blanket for our first Christmas together. He loves blue and red, and my grandmother had just given me a whole bunch of Lion brand homespun yarn. It's that slightly brownish stuff you see in the centers of all the squares. It's got red and blue hues in it. So I made big multicolored striped squares that alternated red and blue, red and blue. I probably used about 1,500 grams of yarn altogether. The blue and red is Red Heart Comfort, and it worked very nicely with the homespun Lion brand yarn, even though they're slightly different sizes, because I used a large hook. I used a size 7 millimeter hook. Even an 8 would have been good for this project too. And it doesn't matter that the yarn was slightly different sizes, but they were both acrylic, so when we wash this blanket, it moves very well together, and it's held up pretty well over the course of our time together. This is an example of a stash busting blanket. Every once in a while, I do pull out my stash and I evaluate what I have too much of, too little of, and one year I had a lot of blue yarn. So I pulled it all out of my stash. It all happened to be acrylic, which was great, and I started making solid colored granny squares in shades of blue. There's a couple squares where I ran out of one blue and just finished it off with the next because I wanted them all to be the same size. And then of course I had a lot of that sort of turquoisey blue left over, so I put the whole thing together using it. I love this blanket. It's one of my favorites. It's really warm, it's cozy. I love all the shades of blue, and when I spread it out over top of, say, the back of the couch, it makes the whole room feel kind of cool. So that is a neat example of stash busting in a monochromatic way. And there you have it. That's a few of the granny square blankets that I've made over the years and why I put them together, what they were inspired by, and hopefully that will give you a little inspiration on how to use up the granny squares that you end up having pile up around you like I have. And that's it for this week on the Jayda InStitches show. We'll see you again very soon. Until then, stay safe, stay crafty, and have an awesome week. Bye everybody.